The United States and Israel are destroying international law. The International Criminal Court has applied for an arrest warrant for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also its defense minister. And the response of the U.S. government has been to threaten the ICC. The Biden administration is now considering putting sanctions on the ICC. Furthermore, the International Court of Justice in January and May has issued two different rulings against Israel, telling Israel to stop killing Palestinians in Gaza. And Israel has blatantly violated these rulings by the top United Nations legal authority. And the U.S. has continued supporting Israel, arming Israel in violation of these rulings by the ICC and the ICJ. Meanwhile, the U.S. government claims to uphold the so-called rules-based international order, and the U.S. has constantly attacked China, claiming that China is threatening the so-called rules-based international order. But in reality, the U.S. is blatantly violating international law and facilitating the most egregious crimes against humanity while lecturing other countries about the so-called rule of law. We saw the clearest example of this on the 24th of May when the International Court of Justice issued a ruling saying very clearly that Israel must, quote, immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate, which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And in particular, the ICJ was referencing the G Convention, the worst crime a country could commit, the G crime. I don't say that word because when I do, this is always demonetized and censored in the algorithm. But this was a reference to the January ruling by the ICJ, in which the top UN legal body said that Israel can be investigated for the crime of G, and Amnesty International and other mainstream Western human rights organizations have said very clearly that Israel is violating this ruling that goes back to January. And Israel is also blatantly violating the new ICJ ruling from May. And on the 27th of May, Israel carried out horrific war crimes in Rafah, bombing a refugee camp full of tents, killing at least 45 Palestinians, the vast majority women and children. And even the mainstream Western media, which is very biased in support of Israel, even they are harshly condemning these blatant war crimes. Israel is just blatantly bombing women and children in a safe zone in Gaza in blatant violation of a ruling by the Hague. Even the mainstream Israeli newspaper, The Times of Israel, published an article titled, "No Longer Justifiable, Israel Faces International Condemnation for Strike in Rafah." And it notes that even the European Union, which strongly supports Israel and opposes Palestinian human rights, even the EU is now condemning these blatant crimes against humanity. But what has been the response of the US government and also the British government? They are continuing to support Israel as it kills huge numbers of Palestinian women and children with US bombs and US military assistance. The US and the UK spent months claiming falsely that they oppose an Israeli invasion of Rafah. The Biden administration said, this is our red line. Israel cannot invade Rafah. Well, now they're invading and bombing Rafah. And what's the U.S. response? Crickets. The U.S. is supporting these blatant crimes against humanity in violation of rulings by the International Court of Justice. The top United Nations expert on Palestinian human rights, Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, she has been speaking out very loudly about this. And she tweeted in response to the ICJ's ruling, she said, quote, "Let's be clear. As the ICJ orders Israel to stop its offensive in Rafah, Israel intensifies its attacks on it. And then she says, "Be sure, Israel will not stop this madness until we make it stop. Member states must impose sanctions, arms embargo, and suspend diplomatic and political relations with Israel until it ceases its assault." In a follow-up tweet, Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, tweeted, quote, "More horror in the Gaza ghetto. The Israeli occupation forces have bombed a camp for displaced Palestinians in Rafah, causing plastic tents to catch fire and tragically burning people alive. This cruelty, along with blatant defiance of the international law system, is unacceptable. The Gaza G crime will not easily end without external pressure. Israel must face sanctions, justice, suspension of agreements, trade, partnership, and investments, as well as participation in international fora." The UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, said, quote, "Gaza has become hell on earth. Families continue to seek refuge, trying to escape war, but there is no such thing as a safe place in the Gaza Strip. No one is safe, not civilians, not aid workers. No one has been spared." And what has been the response of the Israeli regime? Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said it very clear in January. He said, quote, "Nobody will stop us. Not the Hague. Not the Hague." This is the definition of being a rogue state. Israel is saying that it doesn't care about international law. It doesn't care about the United Nations top legal body at The Hague. They will carry out crimes against humanity and try to exterminate the indigenous Palestinian people. And they know they can get away with it because the US government is protecting Israel and preventing any consequences, shielding it from all consequences under international law. This is the reality of the so-called rules-based international order that US government officials constantly lecture other countries about. And we saw another clear example of this hypocrisy on the 20th of May when the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court applied for arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. In response, Netanyahu published a video on Twitter, and in Hebrew he said, quote, "No one will stop us. No one will stop us. This is a rogue state." And what was the response of the US government? Joe Biden himself attacked the ICC, calling it outrageous. And then the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken participated in a Senate hearing in which he said that the Biden administration is considering putting sanctions on the International Criminal Court. And of course, Blinken and Biden are Democrats, and they called for working with the Republicans, with Donald Trump and his allies, in order to threaten the ICC. Meanwhile, the British newspaper The Guardian revealed that Israel has been threatening ICC officials. This article titled, "Revealed, Israeli Spy Chief Threatened ICC Prosecutor Over War Crimes Inquiry." It notes, I'm reading from the article, quote, "The former head of the Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence agency, allegedly threatened a chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in a series of secret meetings in which he tried to pressure her into abandoning a war crimes investigation." This is under the previous ICC prosecutor. The new ICC prosecutor, his name is Karim Khan. He's a British lawyer. He came into office in 2021. But previously, the former ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, she initiated an investigation into Israel over war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the occupied Palestinian territories. And in order to try to prevent her from doing that, Israel threatened her. And also back in 2020, the Donald Trump administration imposed sanctions on the ICC because it initiated an investigation into war crimes committed by US troops and NATO forces in Afghanistan. So today, the Democrats, the Biden administration, are doing the exact same thing that Trump did, that they criticized Trump for doing. They're now threatening sanctions on the ICC as well. And the hypocrisy has become so blatant, so undeniable, that even MSNBC, which is basically a propaganda organ for the Democratic Party, Even MSNBC is now publicly criticizing Biden. It published an article titled, "Biden claims to care about the rules-based order. So why is he impugning the ICC?" Biden's hostility to the ICC reveals the hollowness of his rhetoric about the international order. At the NATO summit back in 2022, Joe Biden condemned Russia, and he said that when Putin invaded Ukraine, he was attacking the very tenets of the rules-based order. And the United States and NATO are defending this so-called rules-based order. At the G20 summit that same year, Biden claimed the United States is working to preserve the rule-based system and international order. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said this dozens of times. He's constantly talking about the rule of law and the rules-based international order. He has literally tweeted this phrase dozens of times just in the past few years. In fact, this rhetoric has become the main talking point that the US uses to condemn China. We saw this in 2021 when the US State Department published this press release titled, "Blinken Presses Beijing on Violations of Rules-Based Order." Secretary of State Antony Blinken is defending the rules-based international order in the face of the People's Republic of China's global threat to democratic values and human rights. And Blinken said in a meeting in Alaska in March 2021, his first major meeting with Chinese officials, he said that the US government is working to strengthen the rules-based international order. But now we can see how fake this narrative is. It's completely absurd. It doesn't exist. The so-called rules-based international order is a system in which the US makes the rules and orders everyone else around. And the US and its allies violate those rules whenever it's convenient to them. They can carry out the worst crimes against humanity, extermination of entire peoples in the name of the rules-based international order. They can impose sanctions on the ICC. They can threaten ICC prosecutors. They can attack the International Court of Justice at The Hague, all in the name of the so-called rules-based order in which they make the rules. This is bipartisan in US politics, both Democrats and Republicans. In fact, the Republican Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, gave a speech in response to the ICC charging Netanyahu with crimes against humanity. And the US Speaker of the House, an ally of Donald Trump, he said that the US does not recognize the ICC's authority and that the US does not put any body above US national law.
America should punish the ICC and put Karim Khan back in his place. And if the ICC is allowed to threaten Israel's leaders, we know that America will be next. There is a reason that we've never endorsed the International Criminal Court, because it is a direct affront to our own sovereignty. We don't put any international body among or above American sovereignty, and Israel doesn't do that either. Congress is reviewing all of our options right now. We have some very aggressive legislation that we're going to push as quickly as possible. It will impose sanctions. And if the ICC moves forward with its absurd warrant arrest or request, this is going to be an even bigger international problem.
So the US is boasting that it's a rogue regime. It does not accept international law. And in response to this, the UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, she said that the US rules-based order is an attempt to replace the international law-based order. And this has become increasingly obvious. The US does not care about international law. On the contrary, it is the US and its allies that are attacking international law on a daily basis. They are the world's greatest threat to international law. And this whole narrative of the so-called rules-based international order is an attempt to replace international law with a totally arbitrary set of rules invented by Washington in order to serve its political and economic interests. And Washington's allies and proxies in Europe are doing the exact same thing. In 2021, Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who by the way was never democratically elected, he gave a speech in which he claimed that the UK is defending the rules-based international order. Back in that same year, Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel, she claimed, quote, "A rules-based and reliable international order is the basis for peaceful relations between states." And the current government of Olaf Scholz in Germany is using the same exact rhetoric. The German Federal Foreign Office published a fact sheet on the Indo-Pacific region on their official website, and they said, quote, "Germany is committed to strengthening the rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific region." And of course, they were using this in order to attack China, implying that China supposedly does not follow the rules, and the West supposedly does. But meanwhile, Germany, along with the US, is arming Israel, helping it carry out these crimes against humanity in violation of the ICJ and the ICC. BBC created a graph that shows that 66% of the weapons that Israel buys come from the United States, and 30% come from Germany, and 5% come from Italy. So the US and Europe are arming Israel as it violates the rules of the so-called rules-based order, as it violates international law, which is what actually exists, not these nonsensical so-called rules that are always changing whenever it's convenient for the West. This is exactly why Nicaragua, the Sandinista government, took Germany to the International Court of Justice, accusing it of being complicit in Israel's G crime, because Germany has continued to sell Israel weapons, making it directly complicit. And meanwhile, the German government has been brutally repressing pro-peace protesters in Germany who are condemning the German-sponsored crimes against humanity committed by Israel, arresting not only Palestinians, but also arresting many Jews. Many Jewish peace activists have been arrested in Germany for the so-called crime of opposing these crimes against humanity carried out by Israel with the support of the German government. This is the reality of the so-called rules-based order, and it sure looks a lot like Germany in the 1930s. The irony is that Israel's German-sponsored crimes in Gaza have become so blatant that after months of non-stop, unflinching German support, the German Foreign Office finally criticized Israel for the first time and tweeted on the 28th of May, quote, "The images of charred bodies, including children, from the airstrike in Rafah are unbearable." And they called for Israel to investigate itself, as if that's ever going to accomplish anything. This is the true face of the so-called democratic West. They don't care about democracy. They don't care about human rights. They only care about their imperial domination of the planet. They only care about extracting the natural resources and exploiting the labor of people across the global south, of their former colonies that they continue trying to colonize. When they talk about the so-called rules-based order, they're referring to the US-led Western neocolonial order, the US empire that seeks to dominate the entire world, that seeks to impose its unipolar hegemony on the planet and prevent the world from being multipolar. That is to say, they want to prevent the world from truly being democratic. They want it to be a global dictatorship run by the Western capitalist powers. And we saw such a clear illustration of this that was published in the Financial Times by the FT columnist Gideon Rachman, who is a neoconservative hawk, and he published a ridiculous article titled "America Breaks Global Rules as It Defends the Free World." This is the nonsensical narrative that these imperialists are resorting to. They say, look, we admit that we are violating the rules of the so-called rules-based international order. He notes that US Secretary of State Blinken, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and other Western officials have talked about the so-called rules-based order. And he notes that in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Blinken argues that the US is standing up for a world based on rules. But he writes, quote, "Rules are meant to be consistent, and America's own actions are undermining vital parts of the rules-based order. He points out that the US sanctions on China, for instance, and the US tariffs blatantly violate international rules, especially in the World Trade Organization. He notes that the US has been threatening the International Criminal Court. And he writes correctly, quote, "In large parts of the world, America's claim to be upholding the rules-based international order is treated with derision." He acknowledges that everyone else outside of the little bubble of the neocolonialist West can see how insanely hypocritical the West actually is. So what is his solution? The FT, this is the newspaper representing the transatlantic Western capitalist class, representing their interests. They have a solution. They say, quote, "One answer is for Blinken and company to talk less about the rules-based international order and more about defending the free world." They're going back to this nonsensical, childish view of the world that was shoved down our throats during the first Cold War, in which they claim that the West is supposedly defending the free world and democracy. And he claims that the US, the EU, the UK, Japan, South Korea, and Ukraine are struggling to contain the territorial and political ambitions of authoritarian countries, above all, China and Russia. This is the childish narrative they're going with. We are defending democracy against authoritarianism. They have nothing else they can rely on. This is the only narrative they have. It's the same old cliched Cold War narrative that we've all heard our entire lives. We all know it's a lie because the US for decades has propped up the most vicious, bloody dictatorships on earth. But this is what he says. This is what the FT is arguing. Quote, "Unlike the defense of the rules-based order, which implies absolute consistency, the defense of the free world involves accepting some necessary inconsistency." So he's acknowledging, yeah, we're going to violate international law constantly when it's in our imperial interest. And he noted, quote, "During the Cold War, the US and its allies made some tactical alliances with undemocratic regimes as part of its broader effort to contain and ultimately defeat the Soviet Union." Now that is putting it mildly. The US propped up the worst, bloodiest dictatorships on earth, including Pinochet in Chile, including Suharto in Indonesia, including the Saudi monarchy, including Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan. The list goes on and on and on. The US backed the worst dictatorships on earth that literally killed millions and millions of people in the name of so-called democracy and human rights. And now they're going to go back to doing the exact same thing. They are doing the exact same thing. And he concluded this article saying that the West needs to engage in international lawfare, that is legal warfare, as part of the emerging struggle between democratic and authoritarian powers. So the Financial Times, the mouthpiece of the transatlantic capitalist class, is saying very clearly, yeah, we don't care about international law. We will cynically, hypocritically appeal to international law when it's in our interest. We don't actually care. It's about reinforcing the Western imperialist order in the name of democracy, which actually we don't care about democracy because, as he admits, we more than willingly supported dictatorships and will continue to support dictatorships when it's in our imperialist interests. In fact, the irony is that you know what countries are now defending international law? China. This is constantly something that we hear in the rhetoric of Chinese diplomats. And we saw it reflected in the joint statement that was signed by Chinese President Xi Jinping and by Russian President Vladimir Putin when they met in Beijing in May. In this statement, China and Russia jointly condemned the, quote, neocolonialism and hegemonism that is being practiced by the Western powers. And they also condemned the West for, quote, attempting to replace and subvert the recognized international order based on international law with a, quote, rules-based order. Multiple times, China and Russia emphasized that they abide by the principles of international law on the sovereign equality of states, calling for respect for sovereignty, non-interference, and respecting the UN Charter. So quite literally, it is China and its allies that are defending the international law-based order, while the US and its allies are destroying the international law-based order and trying to replace it with their own so-called rules that they constantly violate when it's politically convenient in order to try to maintain their neo-colonial control over the planet. It is not exaggeration to say that China is defending international law, whereas the US is destroying international law. And we can see this as clear as day in Gaza, where Israel, an extension of the US empire, an outpost for the US military in one of the most geostrategic regions on earth. Israel is the 51st US state, and Israel is blatantly carrying out crimes against humanity in violation of both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. The US is still staunchly supporting Israel, giving it billions of dollars of weapons, threatening the Hague. This is the reality of the world we live in. And here at Geopolitical Economy Report, we are dedicated to telling the truth about what is going on. And if you like the work that we do, please like and subscribe. Please share our content. You can also consider donating at some of the links below. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.